Okay, well, I'm going to jump right in as people are just logging in. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to the third session in this four-part series hosted by the Climate and Agriculture Initiative BC. Over the last 3 weeks, we've been discussing some of the ways that climate change is impacting BC farmers and ranchers, and our presenters have been sharing different approaches, tools, and resources that provide examples of adaptation in action. If you've missed some of our earlier sessions, we will be sharing the full set of recordings once the series ends next week on November 9th. My name is Shauna McKinnon, and I'm the coordinator for the Farm Adaptation Innovator Program at CAI. And I have the pleasure of hosting today's session on investigating crop suitability for changing climate conditions. Before we begin talking about how climate change interrelates with the crops we grow, I would like to acknowledge that I'm hosting this session today from the ancestral and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. These nations have been stewarding these lands for millennia, and their relationships and deep knowledge of this place holds an important lesson that I think is relevant to the projects we'll be talking about today. Both of these projects are at heart about ways to more closely observe and learn from the land and the climate. As we get started, it would be great to know more about who has joined us today. So please take a minute to introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where you're calling in from and why you've joined. I know our presenters and those participating would really appreciate knowing who's joining us out there today. Please direct your messages to panelists and attendees so everyone can see your messages in the chat. Now I'll just give you a quick overview of how we'll be spending the next hour together. I'm going to start with a very brief background on the Climate and Agriculture Initiative, and then provide some context on how shifting weather patterns and variability is impacting crop selection. Then you'll have a chance to hear from two projects taking very different approaches to supporting farmers around decision-making for crop and variety selection. I'm sure many of you joining us today, oh, hold on a second, my screen sharing has just decided to not work. All right, there we go. Okay, I'm sure many of you joining us today are already familiar with the Climate and Agriculture Initiative. If you're newer to our work, CI was established 13 years ago to provide a proactive and pan-agricultural approach to climate change in British Columbia. In a nutshell, CEI brings together agricultural organizations, producers, governments, and researchers to collaboratively address climate change challenges. Through our work across the province, we develop and implement projects and develop resources and tools to support agricultural adaptation to climate change. The bulk of our work falls into two key program areas, one that addresses regional issues and one that focuses on farm level issues. Both of the projects you'll hear about today are part of the farm level program. That's the Farm Adaptation Innovator Program. The projects we deliver fall within the climate change adaptation programming of the BC Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Fisheries. Funding is provided by the provincial and federal governments through the Canadian Agricultural Partnership. Additional project funding and in-kind support comes from many additional partners, including agricultural organizations, local governments, NGOs, and individual producers. The issue of variability is not always top of mind when we're thinking about the impacts of climate change, but it is a major challenge for agricultural adaptation. When we think about the impact of climate change on weather, we often first think of the longer-term shifts in temperature and precipitation patterns. Tracked over years, these shifts follow a general trend line. For example, higher average temperatures and lower summer precipitation. Some changes may open up new opportunities. More growing degree days and an extended growing season could allow crops and varieties to be grown in new areas. But along with these shifts in weather, we're also experiencing increasing variability in weather and seasonal conditions. Managing through variable conditions has always been a challenge in agriculture, but the timing of essential activities like planting and harvesting, nutrient management, and pest management is becoming less and less predictable. Variability also impacts crop and variety selection. For example, variable temperatures and abrupt temperature swings increase the risk of frost-related crop damage and losses when crops that are better suited to warmer climates are planted here. Or sudden spikes in spring temperatures can cause early bud break. If this is followed by colder temperatures, yields may be reduced. Heat spikes during spring and summer can also affect crop quality. Variability in seasonal precipitation can be equally as challenging. These impacts caused by variable conditions increase management complexity for farmers and also adds cost. In today's session, when we're discussing projects that look at crop and variety suitability, both seasonal variability and those longer-term trends are two interrelated components of climate change that need to be considered together. Variability is an issue affecting agricultural producers across BC, and CI has worked with partners on a number of projects that are addressing this issue. Projects include things like strengthening regional weather monitoring and related decision support tools in areas like the Peace and the Okanagan. There are also crop suitability trials underway on Vancouver Island for drought-tolerant annual silage and winter vegetables. You can visit the variability page, and the URL is there to see a selection of curated resources and tools on this issue. So now let's get into today's presentations. We're going to be starting with a project led by Dr. Elizabeth Wolkovich at UBC. She is developing phenological models to better understand which wine grape varieties will perform best under the changing conditions resulting from climate change. Phenological modeling is used in other wine growing regions of the world, but this is the first of its kind for horticultural crop in Canada. Then following a Q&A break, Dr. Catherine Tarasoff from Agrowest Consulting will be sharing her work to support farmers to do their own on-farm research trials so they can test which crops and varieties perform best under changing and variable conditions unique to their farms. After each presenter, we will have a chance for Q&A. To ask a question, you can just use the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel, and you can type in your question there at any time. There's also an upvote option, so you can give a question a thumbs up if you'd like to see it prioritized to be answered live. Your vote will make the question rise to the top of the queue, and our presenters can answer those first. So it is now my pleasure to stop sharing my screen and hand things over to Dr. Elizabeth Wolkovich. Dr. Wolkovich is an associate professor and Canada Research Chair at the University of British Columbia, where she runs the Temporal Ecology Lab. Her research focuses on understanding how climate change shapes plants and plant communities with a focus on shifts on the timing of and seasonal developments. So welcome, Dr. Wolkovich. It's great to have you here presenting today.
Thanks, Shauna, and thanks everybody for coming. Thanks for inviting me. I'm assuming everyone can hear me because nobody's looking horrified and that you can see a screen. So I will launch into this. If you're here today, you probably already know this, but I did want to set the stage by saying that we know climate change is already impacting crops across the globe. And I would argue one of the most observed impacts is on the phenology. So the phenology is the timing of recurring seasonal events for crops. That's things like bud bursts, flowering, or as I'm showing here, the harvest date. These are harvest dates shown in the deep purple from a well-known wine growing region. This is from the Bordeaux wine growing region, where they have data stretching back from the 1880s. So these are each year's harvest date from 1880 to about 2006. And the temperature of the harvest period is shown in the lighter pink. And what you hopefully can take from this is that there's variability in these systems. Certainly some years are hotter and we have earlier harvests, and some years are cooler with later harvests, but there's a dramatic trend over the last 40 years, which you hopefully can see at the end of this record, where growers are harvesting significantly earlier. This region of the world has warmed about 1.5 degrees already, and so they're harvesting 2 to 4 weeks earlier on average right now. And we see this across crops and other food sources. This is one of my favorite articles of the last year. Rolling Stone did a piece on the 11 foods being impacted. Many of these impacts were phenologically related, and most of them were crops. So they show cranberries, wheat, and grapes here. They also talked about peaches, and I would argue apples are another one where we've really been able to well observe and document changes. And if you're in this area, you probably also hear a lot of forecasts of what will come in the future. And in general, they're often alarming forecasts of what could happen if we have continued warming and shifts in the climate regime with climate change. This is one of the ones that made a bigger splash in my field when it came out about 10 years ago. And it was a paper where they tried to project the future wine growing regions, given what we understand about how growers grow currently. And they suggested that by 2050, with 2 degrees of warming, which is about what we're on track for right now, we would see between 25 and 73% of the world's current wine growing regions lost just due to the shifted climate. But what this paper and study has in common with a lot of the research, I would argue, that's been going on in the last 10 to 20 years, is that it assumes no adaptation by humans, that growers won't change what they do. When in contrast, we have initiatives like the one we're talking about here today that really encourage growers to change. And we know that growers are adapting every year to climate variability. It's a natural part of being a producer. And so they're actively looking for ways to change year to year, as well as over the long term with climate change. And in particular today, I want to talk about adapting and building a more resilient crop system through thinking about variety change. Most crops have high variety diversity. It's actually sort of a rare crop that doesn't. They're out there, but they're not that common. In particular, fruits have a lot of variety or cultivar diversity. So by variety, I mean a unique genetic grouping within one crop. It's very often a unique genotype, and it has a set of important identifiable characteristics. So some varieties are not marketed to people, but are quietly shifting underneath us all the time, like certain citrus. Lots of varieties, though, are marketed. So I think apples are a great example. We've all learned to recognize a Honeycrisp apple in the last 20 years versus a Red Delicious or Macintosh, et cetera. There's over, I think, 1,000 different apple varieties on Earth right now, which is similar to how many wine grape varieties there are. But lots of other crops have a lot of variety diversity that you may or may not recognize that is or is not marketed. So stone fruits like plums and peaches, there's tremendous diversity there as well. BC grows at least 30 different varieties of peaches already and supports some amount of understanding about their differences for growers. And in particular today, I'm going to be focusing on wine grapes for the time I have, but certainly everything I'm talking about applies to any crop where we have this significant variety diversity and we have a perennial crop that growers are trying to manage year to year. And so just to give you a sense of why variety diversity might matter, I wanted to show you results from a couple years ago in my lab. This was a project led by my postdoc, Ignacio Morales Castilla. And what we did is we tried to model variety diversity for wine grapes across the globe using a very large grid cell, so pretty large spatial scale. And we used only 11 cultivars. There's over 1,100 different varieties or cultivars of wine grapes planted today. So this is a very small slice of the potential diversity, but it's what we had data for. This is not where wine grapes are grown currently, it's where our models suggest we could grow wine grapes. And so this is what we projected, with the yellow colors being places where you could grow more cultivars in one region, and the purple color being where you could grow maybe one or two. And so we looked at what you would see with the current or the past sort of 1970s to 1990s climate regimes and what would shift in the future. And so in this case, we allowed growers to change their varieties in the projections. And what we saw is this really enhanced resiliency, including variety diversity in these large scale models, more than halved projected losses of current wine growing regions. So even though we had a very different modeling approach than the paper I showed you at the beginning, we actually saw very similar projected losses of regions of around an average of 50%. But when we allowed this really small amount of variety diversity and allowed growers to shift as warming and climate change continued, it had a dramatic impact on what we would project for the world's future wine growing regions. Places such as France managed to stay more or less intact by simply changing what they grow. And so varieties differ in lots of important characteristics, as I said, but there are a lot of those characteristics that are very climate related and really relate to how growers respond to variability and how resilient a crop might be in a region. And so I'm giving you two sort of classic examples of grapes we grow commonly here in BC. These are two French varieties. So again, just a small portion of the actual diversity that's grown in places like Europe. Pinot Noir is a wine grape that has phenologically a lot of differences from Cabernet Sauvignon. So Pinot Noir is an early budburst grape. If you're growing it, you traditionally have it budburst 2 or more weeks earlier than Cabernet Sauvignon. And when you harvest it, you could be harvesting it 2 to 4, even 5 weeks earlier than Cabernet Sauvignon, which is traditionally a later bud bursting and later harvest grape. So even if you plant them side by side, you would be managing a very different crop time-wise over the growing season. I also showed the leaves here just to give you a sense that these varieties, and this is common across lots of different crops, vary in lots of other attributes. So you see the leaves of Cabernet Sauvignon are distinctly lobed. They have a slightly different vein and leaf structure. And this probably means they have different tolerances to heat and drought that we don't fully understand. So there's a whole set of climate traits that really vary across varieties. But I would argue the most important one potentially for growers right now to think about is phenology. Again, that's where we're seeing a lot of the impacts. So just to walk through quickly why variety phenology level matters, I want to use this simple schematic. I have temperature data from 1 year recently, shown in the orangey yellow line. And I've shown the better part of the growing season, or a little longer than that, for the BC region that I work in, which is the Okanagan. So from March to November. And I laid out the sort of 4 major events for an average year for Pinot Noir. So bud burst would start sometime in mid to late April, could be a little later, flowering in the midsummer. What we call veraison, or the development of fruit as sugar increases, sometime in the late summer, and then harvest traditionally in September or October. And so I think there's several major reasons variety level phenology matters that I want to walk through. The first one, and this is very commonly and well known, is that you have to pick a variety that ripens within the season. And certainly this is a limitation for a lot of growers within BC. There are wine grape varieties that we probably should not grow right now because they wouldn't fully ripen and be harvestable within the current length of the growing season. Most French varieties seem pretty good, but there are certainly some that wouldn't work for that. The other one is that you have to have adequate temperatures for the flowering period. So you want a period of the year when it's warm enough that the plants will develop and be growing well during flowering. But I think this is also a period where growers are really nervous about variability year to year. So if there's a hailstorm or windstorm or high rain event or heat damage during flowering, it has a direct impact on the crop because the plant will either lose the flowers just due to damage, or they will sometimes abort flowers. And the loss of flowers directly leads to a reduction in yield. So there's a real close connection year to year and over the long term to picking something that will flower at just the right time, and also being aware of what the climate and the weather are doing that year. And then finally, the last one is an ideal climate for ripening. So for high quality crops, the ripening period is often really critical climatically. You don't want to pick a variety that's going to ripen really early in the season, because really early in the season is often really hot. And a lot of crops do not develop good flavor or good, for example, with wine grapes, sugar to acid ratios, if they're developing during too hot a period during the year. So this period when the fruiting starts to develop and the sugars increase for wine grapes, all the way to when they harvest, is an absolute critical period. And growers try hard to match the variety so that they're getting it at the end of the season and yet still can harvest it. And as Sean has mentioned, there's also issues depending on your region with bud burst and trying to make sure the crop is not losing tissue early in the season. We don't see that as much right now in the Okanagan, but I know growers on Vancouver Island have seen some of it. So the exact parts of the phenology that are the biggest issue can vary region to region, but I think these are the 3 main pieces where phenology really matters. Getting it to grow within the season, making sure it has adequate yield during that critical flowering period, and then quality at the end of the season. And this is for Pinot Noir. Obviously, it varies variety to variety. So if I had put Cabernet up, you'd see the bud burst a little later, all the events a little later, and harvest can stretch well into November for Cabernet in BC, for example. And certainly, as you're all thinking, phenology shifts with climate change, as I said at the beginning. So we tend to see several major changes that really impact the crops that growers are growing with phenological shifts with climate change. And so if we imagine a traditionally warmer world, which is the major impact we're currently seeing phenologically on crops, most events are now earlier, especially early season events such as bud burst, flowering, and potentially veraison. They're also accelerated. So when you have a warmer temperature, you'll tend to have all the events happen at a faster rate. And that means that, for example, a grower who's managing vineyards across a region, bud burst or flowering might happen in a much narrower range of time, which really impacts how you interact with the crop if you're trying to manage it across space, if you have it all happening at a more similar time and it would have been spread out before. The other big impact is obviously as we shift temperature and climate and weather regimes, that impact could be on fruit sets. So we aren't seeing major issues yet, but certainly growers in places like Europe have had shifts in both the frost and hail regimes that really have impacted their bud burst as well as their flowering, and issues of impacts on fruit set are a big issue, as well as heat damage or too high temperatures in the middle of the summer. So this is something you really want to watch out for, that phenologically you match so that your flowering is still in an adequate time so we don't lose yield. And then the biggest impact I would say we're seeing across the globe is everything shifting earlier in the late season. So the wine you drink today is certainly a higher alcohol wine than the average bottle you picked up 30 or 40 years ago. And that's because across the globe, harvests have shifted earlier. Those earlier harvests mean higher sugar, lower acid, and a different flavor profile. It's harder often to develop the exact phenolics and other compounds you want when you're starting to harvest in hotter periods, as opposed to sort of a longer, slower, cooler harvest period that we had in the past. So hopefully that gives you some detail on exactly how complicated it is to think about phenological shifts with climate change. They're going to depend on the local climate, regime, and what are the big impacts there. And they also are going to depend on the varieties that growers are choosing to plant. So predicting them and understanding them and using phenology and variety change as a method to sort of build resiliency into vineyards, for example, is going to depend on being able to put together all these pieces, the local climate, as well as the varieties that growers choose. But that's just what we're trying to do right now with funding from the FAIP. So we have a project underway where we're trying to model local phenology for BC wine grapes. And I want to walk quickly with the time I have left through how we're doing that. So this is sort of, to me, the full list of things we need to do if we want to be modeling phenology for crops across BC and across Canada. The first part is continued model development. We work with collaborators somewhat in the US, but especially in France, who have decades and decades of history of developing agricultural phenological models that they use and have been putting into action in the EU for at least 20 or 30 years. That said, I think we're all coming under greater pressure as researchers to develop models that are actually used on the ground year to year, decade to decade for sort of short-term planning of what's happening this year and long-term planning of what should I be planting if I'm trying to build a vineyard that's resilient for the next 20 to 30 years. So there's lots of little tweaks and changes we want to make those models work the very best for growers. So continual development, improvement of models generally is something we're working on. After that, you need local climate data. Long-term phenology data. So we really rely on growers to share and collect data on their own phenology in their vineyards, especially on the varieties we're interested in projecting. And then finally, we work with growers to use their vineyards to get field measurements of phenology that we gather to both calibrate their data. So if we can better understand with our calibrated data how their long-term phenology data compares to what we're collecting, that gives us a good chance to draw in other data from California or from France or from other regions, because then we can better compare it. And we also use it critically to calibrate our models and see how they're working on the ground. And then finally, we don't work on this, but I think it's important to mention that we want to be thinking about it holistically. So also thinking about the heat and drought tolerance of varieties of interest is a goal. We have a little bit of information on that we try to work in, but we could certainly use more. So the three big pieces are getting that local climate data in my mind. We have worked with Environmental Canada data and some grower collected data. Certainly we wish we had more, but we have a good set of data for that. And then getting the long-term phenology data and the field measurements. So that's where working with companies has been absolutely critical. We work with 3 major companies in the Okanagan Valley to date. We've been working with them for about 3 years. And I was really thrilled when we started working with them. They have over 15 years of phenological data. I will say that's thanks predominantly to one large company, which has done a really nice job of collecting very careful data from bud burst, flowering, varies on all the way to harvest across vineyards. So we have it across the valley and also for over 15 years. Certain growers have different amounts of data depending on who's been running the vineyard at that time, different priorities and whatnot. But we are lucky enough to already have 15 years of data from our growers. And then we've been in the field trying to gather these data of measurements of bud burst, flowering variation, and harvest quality for the last 2 years. So this takes a fair bit of effort. We have to work with the growers who have been fantastic in letting us go to their vineyards. And we've been able to get data on, I think, 6 different varieties. We have a good amount of variety diversity of our own data, maybe 8. And we start early in April trying to get our plants flagged. So you see flagging on each of these vines, and we try to get to every vineyard every 3 to 5 days for the entire growing season. So this is the early season with 2 excellent people in the lab who work on this, Mir Garner and Faith Jones. We continued this year. We had to go back out when we had some change in staffing. So we were out there for May and June. And then we always go back out in August, and we switched measuring, especially bricks as well as other measurements if we can, to try to get a sense of how the berries are actively developing once the harvest, a little bit before the harvest season and as the harvest is underway. So we've been measuring bricks from early August until I think we just stopped 2 weeks ago. It was a very long harvest season this year. So it is intensive work in the field. And to give you a sense of where we are, so we got the long-term data from growers about 2 years ago. And again, we were able to get 15 years of data across over 10 or 12 varieties and over 20,000 observations from growers across the valley. Cleaning those data so that we could actually analyze them has taken a little longer than I expected. So we spent 18 months cleaning the data with a lot of hands on deck to do that computationally. And we're still working to match certain vineyards to location. So there is a fair bit of effort to actually get sort of high quality clean data, even if growers have done an incredible job of collecting it. You can see a little bit about the historical trends in the raw data. We just posted fact sheets for budburst, flowering, and veraison. You can see it on our website, or I think you can also see it on the initiative's website. And they give you a sense of the trends over time across the valley, as well as the differences in varieties. So those are available to download. We've been collecting data in the lab or in the vineyards by the lab for the last 2 years. So we did it through COVID last year as best we could. And we've had a great growing season from April to mid-October this year, where we've been collecting data, as you can see. And the model development is underway. So we work on phenological models that use nonlinear methods to try to account for the fact that some temperatures are too high or too low for grapes. And I think we'll have our first results on those models next year in the spring, with the hope that we can share them with growers and be actively sort of testing them against what we're seeing in the field next summer. That is the dream. In terms of extending this to other crops, although I've been talking about wine grapes, I want to stress that most crops that we have here in BC that are fruit crops have a high level of variety diversity. Wine grapes are a great example, where we have 1,100 planted wine grapes. We only get maybe 10 or 20 of them in most places in the Okanagan, but there's a lot of diversity. And it's similar for other crops like apples and stone fruit, where there's a lot of diversity out there, and some of it is actively really used already. We just need to harness it and be able to better model and understand it. Ideally, a crop should have historical data if possible. It's not critical, but it really helps to have a sense of how the region is acting in terms of the phenology, and to map the sort of climate variability in that region and the phenology to that crop. It also allows us to bring in other data a little bit more easily. It's not critical, as I said, if we go out and collect our own data, and I think this is true for all crops, if you have people actively collecting data for a few years, and you can sort of use that to map it to data from other regions, you can still build phenological models. You just have to be a little bit more careful about matching up the region's actual phenology to data from other regions to build those models. And certainly the most critical thing is grower expertise. We had already worked with growers, so we had a sense of the major events that they were interested in, but we've learned a lot about what are the critical events in the Okanagan and what are the critical stressors of variability when they're most concerned about heat damage or harvest. And working with them side by side has really been imperative to both have data to work with, have vineyards to work in, but also to have a sense of what are the major issues, and to have a sense of what they're most interested in and what they most need help with. So they've been fantastic. In terms of prospects for doing this on a more large scale, or my thinking forward about this, I think one big thing we can do better in North America in general is support grower collected data. It is a tremendous effort for us in the lab to collect data. And even though growers are in the field every day, it still takes a lot of time to come up with a good system to record phenological data and to do it day by day, block by block. So finding ways to better support growers and encourage them to do that builds the groundwork for us to build these models for different crops. And then certainly increasing variety diversity. We can't really build great models unless we have some data on a particular variety in the region of interest. So one way to do that is just to encourage growers to consider different varieties and try to provide some basic information for them to think about what varieties might be worth trying and actually growing for a market. The other is to encourage the use of diversity blocks. So in Italy, this is a common practice. It's starting to become a practice in France, where part of the parcel will be set aside for just a diversity of different varieties. And there's certainly import issues there too to try to get growers those varieties. More and more in Europe, I'm seeing more research blocks. So Bordeaux has a big block called ViteAdapt, where they planted over 50 different varieties. It's a mix of what they already grow and 30 varieties that they think could be best for their region in the coming decades. And they have researchers actively managing that to try to get data and understand what is an ideal variety for different parts of the region in the future. And then I want to just mention hardiness. It's something we work on a little bit in the lab, but certainly matching the phenological models to hardiness models is one of the biggest, I think, challenges and opportunities for Canada. So that's really, growers are often limited by hardiness and winter cold. And if we can put those models together, especially if we have accurate models for sort of fall hardiness and spring hardiness, I think that would really help with selecting varieties for the future. Very quickly, I wanted to close with one way that the French have started thinking about adaptation and resiliency for their crops, and they have sort of 3 categories of what you should do. The first is, what are the things we should be doing for crops with or without warming? Sort of looking at crop resiliency and asking where we could improve the crop in general, and it would help whether or not we were dealing with climate change. And I really think of variety diversity as one of these parts. There's many different varieties out there for most crops that we should probably be thinking about or understanding more about, and it would be helpful for the crop whether or not we were dealing with climate change. Then they talk about, no matter the degree, what should we be doing that will help no matter how much warming we experience. And that certainly is also variety diversity to me. And finally, the reason we build phenological models is this third one, where we hope that we can have scenario specific projections for growers. I would say the most limiting factor there is having a scenario that we all agree on as a globe, which we're certainly working on. But those are sort of, I think, 3 categories to think about when you're talking to growers about what can we do, how do we change? Some of these are changes we should make no matter what, and some of them will work no matter what type of warming we're facing. And I think that is variety diversity, hopefully. Okay, with that, thank you all, and I will stop sharing, I think.
That's great. Thank you so much, Dr. Wolkovich. You gave us a lot to think about in terms of breaking down why phonological modeling is valuable, and then also bringing in some of the experience in France. It's very interesting to hear. We do have time for questions, so please type in your questions for Q&A. Those links that were shared for the State of Wine website and the fact sheets, we will share those out in our wrap-up email tomorrow. I do have a first question here for you. Do you see crop insurance looking at your data and adjusting rates based on anticipated suitability of crop varieties?
I'm not quite sure what they mean by, I mean, I certainly think that certain insurers do have data on variety and crop issue. They have the same data that I have. And many of the insurers, at least that I know of in Europe, do use phenological models as a way to think about what's going to be the biggest problem, what they should insure. I don't actively work with crop insurers, so I can't give much information beyond that. But certainly, yes, I know that certain insurers are using data such as the type I use and phenological models such as the one I use to think about what they want to insure. But I don't know if that's true in Canada.
Great. Well, thanks for that. There is a question just around modeling of field crops like wheat. I'm assuming that you yourself have not done that, but do you know if that is being done?
And the question is, oh yes, there's actually a full the AgMIP consortium is a major sort of international consortium that has put together models of wheat. Some of those are phenological, many of those include a phenological aspect. And so there's an entire set of model comparisons for wheat, rice, and corn. It's certainly an area where there's been a lot of active model development, and almost all of those models have almost all of them have a phenology component.
Great. There's also a question just asking how you could use phenological modeling to determine crops you could grow, wine grape crops you could grow in colder conditions. So it was sort of, what are the limitations of this modeling? How extreme can you go when you know more information about the phenological data?
Yes, I'm just putting up my thanks slide because I was running so slow on time, or late on time, I forgot. So I wanted to thank all of the great people and funding we have. In terms of short seasons, I think is really what this is getting at. Yes, there is a couple pieces. One, I think, is building hardiness into these models. So I was just asking colleagues in France how many models we have of crops that include hardiness for grapes, at least. And actually, it's a real weird disconnect where a lot of models of crop suitability don't include hardiness. So I personally think for questions like that, getting a model that melds hardiness and phenology could be one of the biggest issues, because if you can figure out when you're really limited by late season frosts or when you're really limited by harvest, like that late season frost is a hardiness issue and that harvest is a phenology issue, putting those together is critical. So I think that's the limiting factor. But certainly there's lots of wine grapes that grow in a short period. And then there's lots of wine styles, such as sparkling, that allow you to harvest a little earlier. So I didn't have time to talk about this, but certainly the style of wine you produce is going to impact when you need to harvest it, which is a whole separate issue. So I don't see it as actually a limitation beyond the fact that I think people in those regions often critically need the hardiness data and they don't have it.
Yeah, and you might not be surprised, but there's a couple questions that popped up in the Q&A around, how far north can you go? The hardiness issue is definitely one that's of keen interest in BC. I'm going to just give you one last question to answer live, and then you could answer a few more of them by type.
Sure.
So one of the questions is, which phenological traits in grapes have been most affected by climate change over the last 15 years? And do you think that it would be similar for cherries and apples?
That's a great question. I would say it really depends on the region. So right now, Europe, where I work part of why I work there is it's warmed more than parts of Canada. It's warmed a lot. It's warmed 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius already. The biggest impacts they're seeing are on veraison and harvest, I would say. They definitely see earlier flowering, but they don't see an impact. They're not seeing sort of lower fruit set, except in extreme heat years or sort of really rare events. But the earlier harvest, I think, has been a challenge for growers there. So traits about ripening, I would say, are the biggest ones. And then do I think it's similar for cherries? And what was the other one?
For cherries, and I think, no, I can't remember.
Okay, well, I was going
My
to say,
apologies.
again, I think it's region specific. So there are some regions where sort of that fruit set issue becomes a bigger part. And I don't think that would be so for cherries. But I don't know for sure. So I think it's a little bit region specific. I would argue the biggest impacts we're seeing right now are about shifting earlier in the harvest. And that certainly does affect both just managing harvest, but also the quality of the grape you get or the cherry aspect.
Great. Well, thank you for that. I do want to move on to our next presenter.
Yes.
So we have time for that. So now I would like to introduce Dr. Catherine Tarasoff. She is a research scientist with over 15 years of research experience and 10 years of experience as a university educator. Since 2016, she's been working to support producers to carry out their own on-farm research. Welcome, Dr. Tarasoff. It's great to have you presenting with us today.
Thanks. Thanks everybody for being here, and thanks Elizabeth for the great intro. I am going to talk a little bit about phenology in my presentation. So for those of you who don't know me, Dr. Catherine Tarasoff, I lead Agrowest Consulting Scientists, and today I'm going to talk about producer-led research for crop selection. So what is producer-led research? Well, it's very site and management specific research that addresses a particular need or question that the producer has, and it can easily be linked to their historical management practices, their future management, hopes, dreams, aspirations. It really comes down to them assessing their goals and their sort of their on-farm needs moving forward. It's not meant to be published. It's not meant to undergo any rigorous scientific review, but it does need to follow a specific set of experimental design criteria. And this is to ensure that the producer really has confidence in their results and that they can share their results with other producers, knowing that what they did was done in a sort of an experimental design platform. So I'm going to just share three examples of producer-led research that's been conducted. I'll share my website link later that has all of the case studies, and so you can read all the different projects that have happened over the past few years. The first one is kale as a forage crop, and this is a producer in Vanderhoof. This work was done with the BC Forage Council, and I want to give you some background because each project is so unique to the producer and what the producer is struggling with or challenged with. So for this producer, he owns a small feedlot and he spends a lot of money putting up winter feed. And so he had heard about kale being grown as a forage crop in the Peace area. And he thought, well, maybe it would work here. He didn't know anything about the feed value. He didn't know anything about whether it would survive, not survive. So for his project, he decided that he would just set up a small corner section in one of his larger fields because he could not sort of tolerate crop failure. He needed all of his feed. So he said, okay, I can risk manage about 1/4 of an acre. So we designed a project that would allow him to collect some information and to observe what was happening, but do it on a small scale. And so he planted his kale mixed in with oats. And then every 2 weeks, starting November 5th, he went out, he took some leaf tissue samples, put them in a bag, and we shipped them off to for forage analysis. And so for him, he kept this going till December 17th, and the relative feed value stayed high, the protein stayed high. Kale grew really well in Vanderhoof, and there was no history of kale being grown in Vanderhoof as far as he knew and his dad knew. So he's now expanded, and he grows kale on at least 3 fields, and there's more producers in Vanderhoof now growing kale as a forage crop. So that was just a new thing that he tried. It was based on his need for winter feed and to save money putting up winter feed. He needed good quality food. And so now kale is expanding as a forage crop in Vanderhoof. The next project is totally different. So this is variety trials for alfalfa, but not for yield, for protein. So the background on this project is this farm manager was working for Top Hay, which is a compression plant, an alfalfa compression plant in Vanderhoof. So they take, the big bales of hay, and they compress it down into little blocks, and then they put it in a shipping container. And for this group, they ship it over to the Middle East, where they get top dollar for very high quality alfalfa. And they're really trying to get into and stay in the Middle Eastern kind of horse market. It's very lucrative. So for him, though, he said the problem is, the weather is changing in Vanderhoof. And yes, there's some varieties that have amazing protein levels, but what if I can't get out to harvest them at that time? What if it's too rainy? What if we don't have a window for haying? So what he wanted to know is what variety maintains its protein throughout the different stages of the phenological development. So he tested 6 varieties, all which are well known to grow in the Vanderhoof area. They're all very popular. And then every couple of weeks through the growing season, we went out and we harvested tissue based on its stage of development, because of course the field doesn't develop evenly. It's sort of, it comes in little patches as plants develop at their own rate. And what he found was that Stealth was the variety that kept its protein the most consistent through all the stages of development. So it gave him the greatest flexibility in harvesting. And WL319 and Top Hand are 2 really kind of hot varieties for alfalfa in Vanderhoof right now, because they do have really great protein levels. But for him, he couldn't tolerate that because they just crash once you move into the early flower stage. The protein level just, drops right off. So for them, he recommended moving their new seedings into Stealth so that they would have that higher protein level if they have to harvest a little early or a little late. So the last one I want to talk about is also a totally different, totally unique to the producer. So this producer is in Rock Creek, which is a very dry part of BC. If you haven't driven through it, it's dry, it's rocky, it's fairly inhospitable. And his family had been farming the same piece of land for about 100 years and conventionally. And in the past, probably 5 years, he'd switched to no-till, which had improved things somewhat, but he was finding that his annual forage crop. Oh, he's a dry land farmer, so no irrigation. And he's finding that the crops are diminishing over time. You know, like every year is getting worse and worse. The ground is like powder dry. None of the snow melt is sinking in. And so he was interested in forage radishes. You can see a picture of them on the bottom. They're like a daikon radish with a big root, big sort of carrot-like root. And so he was wondering if the forage radish might be able to break up that hard pan layer. We couldn't even barely get a soil penetrometer in deeper than 4 centimeters, 3 centimeters. And there's a picture in the back. You can see that radish right there. That's where the hard pan layer is, because that radish takes this sharp turn. So only about maybe 3 centimeters below the ground. So we mixed forage radishes in with his oats, peas, and triticale. And it was seeded, of course, no-till. And then the control over here was just his standard oats, peas, and triticale. We took infiltration measurements, not using the typical coffee can method, but using an infiltrometer, but the results are transferable across. You can see that the control has really slow infiltration rates, and the radish has much better infiltration rates. So more water going in per hour is how that's measured. And the other thing, the reason I put the error bars on here too, is because this is another interesting thing, is that the control has very slow infiltration rates and it's very consistent, very little variability. Basically, there's a layer of cement underneath his entire field, whereas the radishes have better, faster infiltration rates and, you know, enormous variability. And that's because the radishes are literally punching holes in that cement layer like Swiss cheese. So if he was to do this, you know, year after year, just keep putting the radishes in, then he would punch more and more and more holes in that cement layer, and he would start to get a more uniform, higher infiltration rate across his field. And this is so that he can capture that snow melt, because he has no irrigation to rely on in this particular field, and he needs to capture that snow melt. And there is less snow coming every winter and less precipitation in the summer to capture too. So that's just 3 examples, and each project was completely unique to the producer's needs. Each project was led by the producer, although I did have to help them define a way to measure or test their question. But the key for them was that they didn't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to try something that's never been done before. In fact, you want to take some knowledge that already exists and just tweak it a little bit for your site. So they all had a good idea that what they were going to test was going to work, but they just didn't know exactly how to set it up to answer their specific question. So that's where I came in to help them with that. But you don't want to reinvent the wheel, especially for a producer. When we look at the forage kale example, he was trying something new and he could not risk a 60-acre field on forage kale. I mean, it would have been silly for him to do something like that. So the project was designed so that he could try something new for the region and at a level that he could handle. If the kale completely failed, he could handle just losing 1/4 of an acre. So there's some resources that I want to steer you towards. If you're working with producers or if you're a producer yourself, there's the guide to on-farm demonstration research. And this is a guide that, that I wrote with the BC Forage Council as the publisher. It's available at Farm West. What I did find with this guide is that it's not really a pick up and run out in the field. There's a lot of thought that needs to go in ahead of time for the producer. And sometimes the producers have a hard time backing up and taking a really big step back and going through the process of thinking about their farming goals. So then we developed these grab and go templates, which are, this one down here is the one with the forage radishes. They are very specific templates that are maybe each template's only 11 pages long. They include your data sheets that you'll need to fill out. The project's basically designed for you to take the template and apply it to your farm, or to modify the template slightly. So for example, with the testing new crops, that producer tried sorghum Sudan grass, which was the most drought tolerant crop for his area. That might not be appropriate for you, but you could follow the same experimental design just with a different crop. And same thing for mulches. That one, he did mulches in cherry orchards. You might not be interested and you may not work in cherry orchards, but the concept of using a mulch is the same. And you can use the same process that he used to test mulches to reduce water use. You could try that on carrots, on potatoes, on strawberries, whatever crop you're working in. So the actual tool is transferable across many different crops. And for me, it's these grab and go templates are just a way to help focus a producer and give them some ideas, and also give them some data sets or data sheets to use in the field. So I'm just going to look at them a little more closely, not really, but at this testing new crops. It's really designed to take out the guesswork for producers. And this photo shows you just an outline of what's inside that template. So this is basically the table of contents. And it has a section on how to get started and determining what to test. So it's really important to talk with your regional agrologists and agronomists about what is actually suitable to test in your area. One thing you really don't want to do is you don't want to stretch the sort of the ecological tolerance of a crop too far. You don't want to bring something from Florida that works great in Florida and try growing it in Vanderhoof. It's just a little stretch or a little tweak. The best location for your test plots is really important. You don't want to put half of your plot on the top of a hill and the bottom half of your plot on the bottom of the hill, because then the impact of a dry location and a wet location is going to far outweigh the impact of whatever you're testing. It shows you how to lay your test plots out. So that's the example there on the left. You want to make sure that you put it in a section of the field where you're away from a tree edge, where you have room to turn your equipment around so that you're not driving your equipment through your plots all the time. You want to avoid any real anomalies like a wet area. You don't want that running through one of your plots. You want to give room to get in and out of your gates and drive your equipment around so that you're not driving it through your test plots. And then we go through how to apply your treatments. Harvesting and weighing samples is really important. Here's a picture of a hoop in a field of alfalfa. It's really important that you take at least 10 samples per treatment. So there would be 10 hoops in here, 10 in here, 10 in here, 10 in here. It's important that producers are not encouraged to just harvest the whole test plot and count the number of bales that came off. That will give you no idea of variability across your field. And then a little bit on analyzing the data. I tend to stick to just averages and ranges. And then of course, how to interpret the results. Sometimes there's no difference in your actual results, but the difference might be in the cost of the treatment. So if you have no difference between a low seeding rate and a high seeding rate, why would you seed a high seeding rate? It might cost you twice as much. So the difference is sometimes at the front end of the study, not the back end of the study. So here's the resources available for you to go check out. We have the full research manual that's can be downloaded, PDFs. There's a bunch of case studies, and now we have the grab and go templates that you can look at. And there's a few upcoming events that you might want to be aware of. The BC Organic Conference, I'll be leading a half-day workshop, and I just spoke with the conference coordinator, and there will be the option to attend just one day of the event if you wanted to participate in the workshop. It's an in-person event in Kamloops, so you would need to make your way to Kamloops or be in Kamloops. And the idea of this workshop is that people come ready with a calculator and a pencil, ready to design their own on-farm producer-led research. Next, coming up are 2 one-hour webinars hosted by the Kootenay Boundary Farm Advisors. You can check out their page for the events. That's going to be sometime late January, early February. And then you can always contact me if you want to organize a regional workshop for producers in your area. I find that it's at least a half a day to get producers up off the ground and for them to be able to leave with a project that they can implement on their farm in the spring. So there's my email, and feel free to reach out and contact me. Please check out the webpage to read the templates and to look at them. With the time that I have today, I can't go through each template step by step. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Dr. Tarasoff. It's great to have you. We do still have a few minutes for questions, so please do pop your questions into the Q&A, and we will be sharing the links to the full templates as well. So I'll just give a minute here, give people a chance to put their questions in. While I'm waiting on that, I will just give a quick reminder that next week we have our last session, which will be next Tuesday, and it's focusing on agricultural water management. There is a question, I don't know that it relates so well to your research, but it is around whether organic agriculture can pose an alternative to climate change. Maybe this is something that's not really a question for on-farm research.
Well, I think, you know, any crop, any agricultural practice, whether it's organic or conventional, of course, can be done in a way that helps with climate change and provides adaptation to climate change. Organic farming is just interesting because it uses a lot of the tools that were already in place. Like they're already using mulching. So those are, in some ways, I feel like organic producers may already be one step ahead in that area. And it'll be really interesting for me to see what types of research projects come out of the BC Organics conference when I work with those producers.
Yeah, great. Thanks for answering that. I also have a question from Dr. Wolkovich, who unfortunately could not type into the Q&A because panelists are not able to. And so her question is, how do growers manage the cost of the trials?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And you know what? One of the really key things for these projects is that they need to be manageable by the producer. So we design projects that are very simple, that use the equipment that the producers have on hand. So there's no special, you know, besides getting a hula hoop from the dollar store, or some of them, you know, they need to go out and buy a digital scale. But we design projects that are really simple and straightforward and try to only answer one question with the project. And sometimes the producers, in part of the planning process, they realize they don't have the time. And so the project has to be narrowed down. And I think we all have this experience with working with, say, grad students, that they start out with a massive project and then they need to focus and get to the real essence of what the question is they want answered. So yeah, it has to be very simple. It has to be straightforward. They have to be able to do it with the equipment they have on hand and with no extra stuff, like no drying ovens, no, sometimes stuff goes off to forage analysis, but yeah. Sometimes we start out like this and we end up with like a very, very narrow project.
Great. Well, we are at the hour now, so I am going to have to wrap up. But of course, you can follow up with today's presenters. Thank you so much to both of you for presenting today, and thanks to everyone who took the time to join. If you want to keep up to date on these projects and other CI events and resources, you can subscribe to our newsletter. I think Rachel's going to share that in the chat. Yeah, and I hope you can join us next week. So thanks again, everyone, for joining, and I hope to see you next week.